Good morning. I'm going to get started. Welcome to Windows. You may have heard of the New Atheists. Anybody have heard of the New Atheists? Whole movement of people writing books, best-selling books, millions of books, millions of people reading them. And the basic thesis is that when you look at our world, there's violence, there's injustice, and there's suffering, and that proves there is no God. You go up to the front of the plane, you open the cockpit door, nobody's flying the plane. Christians admit, yes, violence, injustice, suffering. It's a fact. What we argue, however, is that God has, for some reason, involved himself in the struggle, first in coming into it very directly in the person of Jesus Christ, and then in making we, the body of Christ, the hands and feet that prove God is in the fight against violence, injustice, and suffering. Chris Heuertz, who's here today, has spent his life bearing witness to the possibility of hope in a world that has legitimate reasons to wonder if God is good. Originally from Omaha, Nebraska, Chris graduated from Asbury University and then moved to India, where he was mentored by Mother Teresa for 3 years. Shortly after that, obviously inspired, he helped to launch South Asia's first pediatric AIDS care home, creating a safe haven for children impacted by this global pandemic. For the last 20 years, Chris and his wife, Felina, have served with Word Made Flesh, a community that serves women and children victimized by human traffickers in the commercial sex industry. This has taken Chris to over 7 countries, working among the most vulnerable of the world's poor. Outreach magazine has listed Chris as among the 30 emerging influencers reshaping leadership. Chris is the curator of unlikely friendships, an instigator for good, a champion of collaboration, a witness to hope. He believes in and fights for a renewal of contemplative activism. In addition to writing 3 important books, most recently Unexpected Gifts, Discovering the Way of Community, he is known especially for his provocative storytelling. It's our privilege to have this champion of the gospel in Windows this morning. Please welcome with me Chris Heuertz.
Can I touch this? All right, good morning. How y'all doing? Yeah. It's good to be here. I appreciate you all including me in your community's rhythms, and appreciate you all making space for some time for reflection. The school I went to required that we show up 3 times a week for chapel, and they legislated it ruthlessly. So we had assigned seats. They had folks up in balconies checking that it was actually us, not a prospective student in that seat. If we were late, if we were sleeping, if we were studying, if we were talking to the person sitting next to us, we actually got 1/3 absent. And so I didn't respond so well to that sort of legislation, and found myself frequently on chapel probation, which is a real thing there. So I show up to these spots, not sure sort of what the tone and the environment will be, but appreciate you all showing up this morning, because I think you didn't have to, right? Awesome, good for you. Well, maybe I'd like to start a little bit with some context. As was mentioned, my wife and I have spent 20 years in a community sort of working with folks on the margins, and even that language I think is unfortunate, because I think if we look at the life and the ministry of Christ, and we look at Christ as the center, then the margins become sort of an orientation, not a location, and people like us would actually find ourselves on the margin of Christ's reality. But we've worked with people in poverty. We've worked with folks who've actually experienced tremendous suffering and exploitation. And it's caused a lot of reflection for us over the years. What we thought early on was that community would sort of sustain these vocations of service. And if you have spent much time sort of trying to build or stay in community, you realize very quickly that community in and of itself is actually quite challenging to sustain. And you may be drawn to communities that look like they're doing good work in the world, only to find yourself sort of dealing with the drama of trying to stay in that community. And so we very quickly realized that some of the hardest work we were doing wasn't on the streets of Rio or Calcutta or in Freetown, but it was actually sort of around the table. And that became very discouraging for us. And quickly what we saw was people didn't last. They didn't stay. They cycled in and out. And rather than community actually being something that sustained our vocations, it became sort of a hindrance or a challenge to staying faithful in these vocations of hope. And so for 20 years, what my wife and I have really sort of tried to do is to name the gift of community as something that incubates these types of vocations. And what we've done is we've really moved into sort of this commitment to a contemplative spirituality as what actually sustains these vocations. And so last fall, my wife and I launched a Center for Contemplative Activism, and we're working with practitioners and activists. We're working with folks who give themselves to social justice movements, because if you're around a lot of folks like this, you quickly realize a few things. Number one, these are some of the most crusty, grumpiest, unattractive people that you come across. They're doing beautiful things, but you don't want to be with them because they're a little mean or a little judgmental about it. Sometimes they think that they're the only one doing something substantial or important. And that's actually sort of a brand fail for folks who care about justice. Secondly, we see that a lot of these folks do a really great job at taking care of someone else, but they do a terrible job at taking care of themselves. And actually, there's a breakdown of integrity and credibility in that. And third, what we see is these folks who are involved in these kinds of vocations of hope perpetually sort of teeter on the edge of burnout. And that's unhelpful. And if you show up, let's say, into a red light area, if you show up into a community of youth that live and work on the streets, or a population of kids who've been forced to fight in civil wars, and you come with these notions of hope or freedom, and then you don't last, you have actually continued to be part of a tragic story of disappointment. These women and these children deserve better. And so don't do that to them, and don't do that to yourself. And so through the Center for Contemplative Activism, my wife and I are actually trying to work towards a renewal of contemplative spirituality for folks on the front lines, grassroots practitioners, activists, and missionaries. And so that's a little context. And sort of looking back on 20 years of this, there's a lot of ways that we've failed. There's a lot of ways that hopefully we've stumbled forward, but there's a lot of things that we've done terribly. And as you can imagine, sort of giving your life to these types of vocation, and as many of you probably experience in community, you live with a lot of regret, a lot of real deep pains. And so I've spent the last year and a half working on what my new book has just come out a couple weeks ago, is called Unexpected Gifts. It's Discovering the Way of Community. And in the book, I name 11 inevitable challenges. So if you stay in a community long enough, right, if you stay in a friendship long enough, if you stay in a relationship long enough, you will experience things like betrayal, failure. You'll experience sort of a restlessness maybe, or you'll have to live faithfully into the undramatic. You may experience bad transitions. In communities, you will always have to deal with things like chemistry. So like, I don't know how many students are in Eastern, and I imagine that in certain spaces you're referred to as a community. But in all communities, you don't always like everybody in your community with. So what do you do when you don't have chemistry with everyone in your community? Or what happens when you have too much chemistry with someone in your community? Maybe you're married or you have a partner, but there's someone that you find yourself sort of effortlessly or naturally attracted to, and maybe you have to work together, and how do you negotiate that, right? Anyway, name 11 of these inevitable challenges. If you stay in community long enough, you'll experience inevitable challenges. And usually these are legitimized reasons for people to leave, actually good excuses for us to leave. And it's usually sort of the excuses that we rub on our transitions. But in the book, I suggest that sometimes the reasons we leave are in fact invitations to stay. And if we stay, these inevitable challenges become unexpected gifts. So what is the gift of failure for a community built around moral principles? What is the gift of doubt for a community of faith? Right? What's the gift of chemistry, sexual chemistry, when you're committed to someone? All right? And so it's very confessional, it's very honest, I think it's very vulnerable, and I think it is not formulaic because it's ambiguous, and I think sometimes if we try to come up with answers for these things, we actually make it worse. So actually that's sort of what I'd like to do this morning is reflect a little bit on some of these notions of community, right? What is community? Why should we stay in community, and how do we build it? And so I want to start with a story. One of the projects that I've been working with and on for several years is called Sari Bari. And Sari Bari is a collective of women who have come out of the commercial sex industry. It's located in Calcutta, India, and for several years, we've helped sort of create alternative economic means for women who've had to prostitute. Started in actually the late 90s, several of our community members were getting to know some folks in the city who were forced to sell sex. And so we tried to sort of follow them back to their neighborhoods and meet their kids and start to get to know some of their friends. But as you can imagine, because of the sort of lucrative economics of the sex industry, we were prevented from sort of entering the neighborhoods in our red light districts. And in fact, a lot of our staff members and community members were threatened, had knives through their throats, were harassed by the local mafia, by the pimps and brothel owners. Some of our staff were even locked in brothel rooms and threatened. But after 7 years of sort of this determination, we were invited in. And as we came into these areas and these neighborhoods, we began asking questions to some of the women. What does freedom look like? What does the first step look like? What is sort of a new tomorrow? How does that sort of emerge? Because as you know, in some of these areas, when children are old enough for sex, they're often prostituted out, and sadly, many times by their own parents. And so the questions were sort of, how do we break the cycle? Because this probably wasn't what you wanted for yourself, and I'm sure it's not what you want for your kids. So these ladies had this idea, right? That they would take old, ratty, sort of used up, recycled saris, right? The traditional dress worn by Indian women, and that they would wash these recycled saris and begin stitching them into quilts and scarves and purses. And it was a symbol of restoration. That something that looked dirty or used up or discarded could actually be made beautiful and valuable. And I think a lot of the women experienced that themselves, feeling dirty, feeling used up, and needing this sort of journey to recovery of identity. And so it was really amazing. It was hope-filled. There was a lot of great energy around it. And so we located one of our first projects in Sonagachi. And Sonagachi is a red light district in Calcutta. It's about 2 blocks long, and they say there's over 10,000, as many as 12,000 women and children, many of them trafficked, right, into this neighborhood. Many of these women, kids, are forced to have sex 12, 15 times a day. And it's just deplorable. It's pitiful. It's terrible. Right, so we were looking at the blankets they're making, and they're beautiful. I mean, just gorgeous. And our project director was in the community center one afternoon, and she was holding these blankets up, and she was admiring them, and she's telling the women that, man, these are pieces of art, every single one of these. And she said, you know, artists actually sign their name to their work, and she said, it'd be great if we could start stitching tags with your names on these so that you could own these, so you could be proud of what you're doing here. And so there's some sort of chatter in the room, and it got a little quiet after that. And she said, so who wants to do this? Now, if you know, or if you've worked with folks who've experienced prolonged sexual abuse and trauma, you know that there's a number of psychological coping mechanisms that people sort of find sort of coming out of sort of maybe their subconscious or their ego. And so if you know someone who prostitutes or sells sex, you probably know them by a name that they use when they're on the line or when they're on the streets, right? There's all this sort of alter alias. There's this identity that's used while they're working. And that is one of these coping mechanisms so that when the assault is coming at them, it's not happening to me, it's happening to this person, this identity, this version of me. And so as our project director looked around the room and she said, what name would you guys like put on each of your blankets? Because they were going to stitch out these really pretty tags that the woman could sew onto each of the blankets. Slowly, but almost in sort of an eruption of communal transformation, almost every single one of those women chose their real name. And it was amazing because some of these women had known each other for 10 or 15 years, but only known sort of the alter alias, the identities they used while they were working. And so there's this recovery, right, of identity. There's this recovery of name and community that was amazing. Well, we have some friends who've helped with Sorry Brain. They've helped do a lot of good work helping us fundraise and create more jobs. And one of them was coming through Omaha. That's where I live, Omaha, Nebraska. We took them out to lunch, and we gave them a blanket, and we told them the story of sort of the recovery of identity, the reclaiming of name. And later that night, he had a show in town, and he invited me out, got me on the list, and so I went. It was at the Mid-America Center, and, you know, it was a huge arena, and it was several thousand folks and sold out joint, and it was crazy because halfway through the show, he set his guitar down, the band walked off the stage, and the spotlight hit him, right? And he's standing at the microphone, and he started to talk about Sari Bari. I couldn't believe it, right? And he started to tell this story of recovery of name. And he asked one of the guys to bring his blanket out, and so he's sitting there holding this blanket, and he started to look for the tag on the blanket, and he found it, and he said, and this one was made by a woman named Mukti. All right, and so I sat there, and I started sobbing, actually. I just remember feeling like, this is incredible. This lady has suffered almost her entire adult life. She has, seriously, been abused in a room the size of probably a walk-in closet in some of the homes that maybe we've come from or live in. She's been called horrible things. She's been imprisoned, unable to leave this little neighborhood. And in this room of thousands and thousands of people, she's being spoken of with love and honor and respect. And it bent my brain. So after the show, I went back to my office real quick, and I wanted to call him up in Calcutta. It was late in Omaha, early in Calcutta, and I was just like, I was still moved. I was like sort of emotional. I was like, I'm not drunk. I have to tell you something beautiful. And so I told him, and I said, and tell Mukti it was her blanket. They held her blanket up, right? Well, does anybody sort of speak or read Hindi or Sanskrit or any of the languages? No. Or maybe. No. Okay. Well, because this happens sometimes. If you know some of these languages, this word mukti actually means freedom, right? Freedom. It's powerful. Could not have sort of tried to chase down a more profound totem or metaphor for all of this. And I feel like I want to start with a story because I feel like in community there's this possibility for us to recover our true identities, for us to actually claim our names. And I think for some of us, we have these beautiful names of restored, of freedom, of pure, of loved, that we don't know. And maybe sometimes we don't even know what they mean. But I think sometimes in community, these things are brought out. I think sometimes in community, if it's a community of vulnerability, there's safety for this to emerge. And so here's the thing. I sort of hesitated early when I started to think about writing about community because, first of all, it's like community is bad language. It's thin out, it's worn out, it's used up, and actually communities become a symbol of pain for a lot of us, a symbol of disappointment for a lot of us. Community is actually sometimes the place where many of us have experienced our deepest wounds. And so though we love the notions of community, actually a lot of us don't participate in community. Secondly, I think that we don't know what we mean by community. And so maybe you have this expectation, right, for what community should be for you or what needs community could meet for you, and then you show up into a group of friends or a community, and none of those things will ever happen. And so you leave. You leave even more disappointed or resentful or frustrated. And what we see happening is a lot of folks are sort of these like serial community junkies where like they move from one group to the next group to the next group, always looking for something they will never find. And so some of us get tired and we're just done with it. And then thirdly, I think sometimes I hesitate to sort of want to talk about community because I think the best communities are the ones where we're free to be vulnerable. But what we really experience in community is the illusion of vulnerability by mistaking it with transparency. Right? So we show up and we're honest. We sort of put it all out there and we're confessional and we're open. But that actually doesn't make us vulnerable. And so it's unsatisfying and we feel cheated and maybe sometimes it's us. That's not actually moving from transparency to vulnerability, and so we're unable to make these deep connections, right? Vulnerability comes from this Latin word for wound. And so to be vulnerable means to be woundable. And I found myself making this mistake time and time again. I use transparency to avoid vulnerability. I'll tell you what you want to know about me, but I'm not going to let you in because I don't want to get hurt. And so it's thin and it's unsatisfying. And I think whatever the other reasons are that maybe some of us are tired of community or these notions of community or even talking about community is the invitation to actually reconsider what it can become. All right? So what is it? This is the thing, like, maybe you are considered a community, the Eastern University community. But that's unhelpful if you actually don't know each other, if you actually don't like each other, if you're not friends. And my sense is that real community is fundamentally made up of human relationships, of people that actually sometimes choose each other or are chosen for one another. There's something that unites us and brings us together. And so for me, for 20 years, it's been vocation. I've shared vocation with 300 people. And yes, I don't like all of them. Some of them I wouldn't be friends with if we hadn't worked together. But we were forced to make choices and options for love. Now, when we started this in the early 90s, what we found is sort of the model for mission in maybe the early 90s that was sort of puttering out and sort of had these gasps of what was left of it was this thing called what we referred to as career missionaries, right? Folks would move to Thailand or Taiwan or Kenya or somewhere. They'd spend 40 years of their life in one place building churches. They'd send their children to boarding schools, and typically they would sort of build these little compounds where the local folks that they interacted with the most were their gardeners or their nannies or their cooks. And I think when we were starting our community back then, we looked at sort of the career missionary model, and we actually sort of rejected it as sort of post-colonial, as sort of unattractive, and as back then as angsty Gen Xers, we were just sort of like, career, that's stifling, right? Well, of course the joke's on us now. But we rejected these notions of career. And so I had moved to India after university, and my wife Felina we were engaged at the point. We actually visited some older career missionaries in Taiwan. And actually, we met up in Hong Kong, and we spent a few days together, and this couple's in their 60s, and I think they're thrilled. It's just like, wow, there's young people still wanting to make these kinds of vocational decisions. And so I think they were sort of looking for these like mentoring moments or whatever. And so we jumped on this little boat, and we went over to Macau. Macau is this little island off the south of China, then was a Portuguese colony. And they took us to a graveyard, and we started walking around this graveyard, and very quickly, my wife and I noticed, like, man, these aren't like Chinese names. It's like Patrick, Elizabeth, and William, and Rebecca. It was like a bunch of Western names. And we also noticed on all these graves that it was folks who died really, really young. So we were like, all right, what's up? So we asked this older couple, what's the deal? And they told us that this was actually a graveyard for missionaries, right? That, late 1800s, sort of when folks would go into overseas missions, if you went to Africa, you'd pack in a coffin because the life expectancy for a missionary in those places then was around 6 or 8 months. And if you went to places like China, you would expected to maybe live only 3 more years because of sort of the immunity of Western folks going to some of these places. And I think they brought us there with this idea of trying to inspire us to count the cost, right? Are we willing to give our lives up for this? Are we willing to let this become sort of what we do until we die? And I think that was very sobering. I think that was very helpful. But like I said, I think we rejected the notions of career. And what we did was we actually made options for community. And so if you sort of look back over the last 20 years in mission, you see that there was in the early and mid-90s this surge for community-based mission movements. And it was great, and I think some of the so-called new monastic communities came out of that. And I think there's a lot of really great organizations and a lot of really great groups that organize themselves around community. But if you look at a lot of these groups, what you see is terrible turnover, a real lack of commitment or sustainability. And so I think what we've seen is we've seen this trend from career to community to, I think in 2013, to cause-based missional motivation. And I think in 2013, we're enamored by causes. We love issues like human trafficking or clean drinking water, or we love to sort of throw ourselves at a cause, and then what we do is we travel and we use the suffering of people who are poor for personal formation or to become the story of the embodied face of the cause that we care about. And I think in all of these sort of motivations for service, if it was career, if it's community, if it was cause, we've seen that, like I said, it's not sustainable. Maybe it incubates these vocations, but it doesn't sustain these vocations. And so what we found after 20 years was that it was friendships It was friendships that allowed us to stay. It was friendships that allowed us to continue to be in a process and a path of reconversion, being converted together and converted into a new we. It was friendships that actually held some of us who made this a career. It was friendships that made that an accountable decision. It was friendships that actually made community. And it was friendships that actually made some of us who have this cause-driven impulse to do good in the world to do it without doing as much harm. Because in friendship, we learn to respect and live lifestyles that reflected respect for our friends who were poor. Now, like I said, I think in friendship, we have to move very quickly from transparency to vulnerability, or it's not authentic. I think if in friendship, if we don't move from transparency to vulnerability, then it's unsatisfying. And we don't feel like we belong. And so what is community? I think I first want to suggest that it's fundamentally friendships. It's fundamentally relationships. It's fundamentally human connections. And those cost us something. And if we really want to give ourselves to those things, we open ourselves up to the possibility of being wounded in those, right? But secondly, why stay, right? So friendships, I think friendships sometimes are about belonging, about actually coming to terms with our need to belong, and about opening ourselves up so that others can be included. And maybe you've heard some of these conversations about sort of belonging, behavior and belief. All right, belonging, behavior, and belief. When a child is born, she belongs to her family. There's nothing that you can do, right, to sort of say, this isn't my baby. If you have a kid, it's yours, right? You belong to your families. And as children, we very quickly learn to behave the right way. We learn what the rules are. Right? We learn not to touch the stove or to look both ways when we cross the street. And even if we're punished for bad behavior as children, we still belong. Well, as we grow up and as we hit our adolescence, and as many of you as students are now sort of becoming illuminated and awakened to who you really are, we move from belonging to behavior to belief. And maybe some of you actually share the beliefs of your parents. Maybe some of you share the beliefs that you were raised with. But I imagine that a lot of you don't. Imagine a lot of you have struggled with what you were told as a child is right or true. And maybe you've come to some of your own conclusions. And if you believe differently than your parents, you still belong to your family. Right? Now, this is sort of the irony of using family as a metaphor for community. Because in most communities, you actually have to believe the right thing to be included. But that's not enough, because then you have to behave the right way to validate your beliefs. And if you can behave the right way to validate that you believe the right thing, then you belong. And that's not fair, is it? That's actually sort of not what we really believe and not what I think we're really trying to accomplish. Right? And so if community is fundamentally about relationships, and if relationships are about belonging, then I think we stay in community so that we can validate this commitment to love, this commitment to one another. And I actually think that belief is maybe one of the sort of least helpful things to organize community around. So we spent a ton of time with Mother Teresa before she died. And as many of you know, several years ago, some of her journals were published, and in the journals, there was sort of this eruption of very confessional letters to her spiritual directors and spiritual mentors. And if you remember some of this, it hit the news pretty hard. It turns out that Mother Teresa had a 50-year dark night of the soul. That for actually 50 years, she really struggled with her faith. And actually for 50 years, she didn't believe a lot of these things. And so I got a lot of calls, I got a lot of emails. People are just like, yo, what's up? You spent some time with her. Was this lady legit or not? And it was like, yes, certainly she was. And I think the people that got a little crusty about sort of her dark night of the soul missed the point, right? That rather than Mother Teresa walking away from her community because she didn't believe or she was struggling with belief, she stayed committed. And I actually think there's something profound in that. And I actually think there's an invitation for a lot of us to reconsider our own sort of option for belief in the community that we're a part of. That maybe you don't believe everything that your community here maybe wants you to, or maybe you think differently about it. And actually, when you leave this place, hopefully you'll have friends who think very, very differently than you, come from different faith traditions than you do, maybe live differently than you do. And you will be presented with an opportunity to choose people over principle, to choose relationships over belief. But I think unless you wrestle with your beliefs, you won't know how to do that. And so I think in community, in a community like this, we're presented with really great options to reconsider what do we mean by faith. And I'm thinking that faith is probably making an option for the absurd, that it's not belief. And I think for some of us who rest our faith tradition in our belief, that will become very disappointing for us, and we may have crises, a crisis of faith, a dark night of the soul. And for a lot of us, that means maybe we'll walk away from our church or our worshiping community, or we'll walk away from some of the ideas that you're grappling with or being formed with in a place like this. But if you can make an option for the absurd, and if you can throw yourself at the possibility of hope, then I think that's faith. And I think faith is a gift. I think faith will carry you into new places. And faith will carry you into new communities and new kinds of friendships and new kinds of relationships, right? So why stay? But I think that the last thing I sort of want to ask is, how do we build this, and how do we build these kinds of groups? And so when I look in a room like this, I spend a lot of time on Christian college campuses. I see something similar about many of them. And this is an observation, not a judgment. And I don't know you all, so like, let it wash over you if it doesn't need to. But many of our communities and our faith communities are usually homogenized places made up of a lot of sort of Protestant folks, where if you're Catholic or Orthodox, like it's a little hard to break in. A lot of white folks, and a lot of heterosexual folks. And if you're the so-called other, sometimes you're sort of reduced to this exotic token that's for window dressing, and then your picture gets put on all the promotional materials, and there's an illusion of what your community actually is. And I think if we really want to throw ourselves at the possibility of building authentic communities, communities of faith, communities that are vulnerable, I think what we need to maybe do very intentionally is to open ourselves up to our communities becoming whole, to our communities actually looking like sort of this notion that we have of paradise, where in the scriptures it says that sort of around the throne of God, from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation will worship God together. And you know what, in real life, most people start with the end in sight. That's why you probably have to take some of the general ed classes that you're taking if you wouldn't necessarily choose them. You take them because you want your degree. You want to finish this thing. But somehow, like, we don't start with the end in sight here, thinking that if that's what the consummation of community looks like in paradise, then why doesn't it look like that now? And if it doesn't look like that now, what does that say about us, the integrity and authenticity of our community? What does that say about our notions of faith? And what does that say about our notions of self? Right? So I look at this this story, right? You remember in I think it's in 2 Kings chapter 3, there's a story of a maternity dispute, right? There's two ladies. They come before Solomon, right? The scriptures tell us that Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. And they're arguing over one child. The story goes something like this, right? In the middle of the night, these two women staying in the same spot, both new mothers, wake up one morning to find that one of their babies has been suffocated. One of the moms, in the middle of the night, rolled over on her child and suffocated that baby. And so there's a corpse and there's a living child. And in the morning, they both start to fight over who gets to keep the living baby. And they can't figure it out. And apparently their community can't help them figure it out. And so they're brought before the king. And the king listens to these ladies, argue. And he's just like, hey, somebody get me a sword. We'll figure this out real quick. We'll cut this kid in half and you can both have peace of it. And of course, one of the women screams, stop, spare the life of the child. She can have him. And Solomon says, you're the mother. You're the mother, right? Well, I look at that story and I think about that because, first of all, it's loaded with symbols, right? The symbol of the women, it says that these two women were women who prostituted. Now, again, I think in our community, we're really, really careful about language. So we don't call people prostitutes. We don't call people lepers or beggars. We don't over-identify people with the ways that they're exploited or the ways that they suffer. We don't use socially backloaded terms that diminish people's humanity. So these women who prostituted, right? And if you look at the scriptures, when you find sort of the stories full of folks who had to sell sex or who prostituted, that's usually a mirror to the church, right? It's usually sort of a picture of us. All right, so I think we look at the story, and I think immediately we find ourselves in that story. The unfaithful bride of Christ, the cantankerous, argumentative, sort of fractured community of Christ arguing over something. Well, what are they arguing over? They're arguing over a Babel. And again, I think in the scriptures we find often this image of a vulnerable child, an image or a metaphor of Jesus. Bursting with potential, but always a target for violence. And then you see a sword. And I think this is the easiest one to sort of tease out because the sword is clearly in this story a symbol of division. And so what are the divisions that this cantankerous, unfaithful bride of Christ continually argues over? Our divisions are sometimes ecumenical or interfaith divisions. Who's in and who's out? Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? Who believes the right thing and who believes the wrong thing? Sometimes, I don't imagine this is true in your community here, but sometimes these divisions are based on gender. Like as if we could sort of rub some Bible on it and theologically ascribe roles for men that are superior to women in communities of faith. Sometimes these divisions are socioeconomic. And so we use words like the poor, which actually shows the distance between us and them because we don't have friends who are poor. We think that we're the ones who need to go and make the world a better place or show up with solutions, rather than following our friends who are poor to God's heart, rather than challenging donor-receptor roles and mission. And then sometimes we use divisions of ethnicity, of nationality, of culture or cultural identity. And I think that a lot of us really want to sort of do a scrub on these things that divide us. I think, and I believe that actually all of us really want to form authentic and whole communities, but I think many of us actually don't live that. So like I said, I know a ton of folks who care about the poor, but they don't know people who are poor. They don't actually have friends who are broke, who can't pay the electricity bill. I know a lot of white folks who care about racial reconciliation but don't have friends who are black. I know a lot of folks who want to pick fights with heterosexism, but they don't have really good friends who are not heterosexual. And I think one of the things that I like to challenge people to do is to say, pull your cell phone out and look at your last 10 calls. Look at the last 10 people you've reached out to or sent a text to. And often, if you look at that, it's a mirror back to you. If you're a white, straight, Protestant, North American, it's probably, and maybe in your 20s, it probably looks a lot like that. And I think what we need to do is to begin to confess the poverty of our friendships. I think when we confess the poverty of our friendships, we begin to name what those areas of division are. And I think when we name what those areas of division are, it invites us into a journey of lament. It invites us into the possibility of creating a new we around the absurdity of faith, a new we around the possibility of belonging, and a new we towards the hope for friendships. And I think that's what a lot of us want. I think that's what a lot of us sort of yearn for. And I think that's what actually, existentially speaking, is what we were made for. But the truth is typically and usually we are the own barrier to these needs not being met in our own lives. That it's usually us that is fundamentally the problem in our communities. And when it's unsatisfying and we don't leave well and when we blame and we go to the next group with our script looking for our needs to be met in a different way and we sort of let everybody else in that community become a character in our story, we will create sort of these habitual, unsatisfying community experiences that are marked by pain and resentment and disappointment. And I believe that we can do better because I believe that we want better. We want more, and we need more. So I'm going to close with this little story, and then it looks like we might have a minute or two for a couple questions, and then I guess there's going to be a talk-back lunch if anybody else wants to talk a little bit more about this. But I went on an Ignatian retreat, the spiritual exercises, last fall with my spiritual director, and he told this story, and I just can't shake it. My spiritual director is this like sort of scrappy, tough guy, Irish priest, this Jesuit, old guy. And he was visiting this elementary school, and he was talking to this little girl, this third grader, and partway into their conversation, she realizes that Father Gillick can't see. And in fact, Father Gillick lost his sight when he was 8 years old. So just like a little kid, right? She sort of just blurts it out, like in mid-sentence, she sort of arrests the conversation she was having, and she's like, "You're blind." And this old man just like, that's not news to me. But before he could sort of say anything, she moves from shock and astonishment to realizing that he's blind to sadness. And so with a real sadness, she goes, "You don't know what you look like." Right? I mean, it's really profound for a little third grader to just sort of go from, "You're blind" to, "You don't know what you look like." And again, before Father Gill could say anything, she says, "You're beautiful." All right? You're beautiful. And I think that story is our story. We're blind. We don't know what we look like, but we need somebody to tell us that we're beautiful. We need somebody to remind us of our name. We need somebody to acknowledge and affirm the good in us. And I think that happens in community. And I think that happens from the most unlikely friendships in community. And I think that happens when we're so different from the people that we're in community with, but we're vulnerable, that we're surprised. And so you're beautiful. But it's not really fair for me to tell you that because I don't know you. And so I urge you to sort of give yourself to the possibility of becoming who you are, recognized for who you are, in friendships that become communities, right? So thoughts or questions or comments or smart remarks? Okay. Well, I appreciate you all having me. It's great to be with you. Pray for us as you think of it, and behave.
We've had a lot of great speakers at Windows this year. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think he said some things that for me are quite profound. The idea that transparency is different from vulnerability. It's pretty important, right? I don't even want to look at the last 10 people I called on my cell phone. So, Chris, thank you for being with us. You get a chance to talk more to Chris. We have a luncheon that begins at 11:30 in Baird Library. And you can sit and have lunch, and on us if you don't have a meal plan, and talk to Chris about some of these things. I have lots of questions myself. In addition, Chris has a number of books outside, right when you go outside the doors, and I know that I'm going to buy one of them right away. The one on community that you just wrote, fascinating to me. So at any rate, thank you, Chris, and you guys have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.